So I'm Liz Thornberry. I'm an assistant professor of African history at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York. And I do research on the history of rape and sexual violence in 19th century South Africa, including on a particular form of sexual violence that takes the form of abduction for the purposes of marriage. So my research is on the way that colonialism, including the creation of colonial legal systems and also missionary activity in South Africa, reshaped indigenous understandings of sexual consent and marriage. I think the most surprising finding is probably the extent to which consent itself is debated within African communities in the 19th century, that there are really a lot of competing understandings of consent. Some people think that consent to marriage or to sexual interaction should be vested in families. Some people want to see a kind of individual autonomy over sexuality, and some people are very invested in a kind of religious understanding of sexuality, and that all of these debates, which are obviously very vibrant in contemporary South Africa, are also going on within African communities in the 19th century. Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, it really illuminates these fundamental questions of consent that everyone has to deal with in deciding, what marriage means to them. Anyone who's getting married has a kind of implicit understanding of what the marriage contract or what the marriage agreement involves, what obligations it entails between spouses, and who has the kind of right to consent to enter into that contract. And so I think this is broadly true of studying forced marriage, of studying kind of sexual violence, that often by studying these kind of anomalous situations, we actually come to a much better understanding of how people understand kind of everyday normal forms of marriage and what the obligations that even people who are in very happy, satisfactory marriages understand themselves to have to each other. Yeah, I mean, certainly in the South African context, so like I said earlier, I work in part on this particular form of forced marriage that has a particular name. It's called Ukutwala marriage. And one of the things that matters about that name and the difference between calling it Ukutwala marriage or calling it forced marriage is that to call it Ukutwala marriage is really to assert that this is a customary practice that has some form of legitimacy within South African history, and that therefore maybe the state should not intervene or should not intervene very harshly, should only do kind of minor modifications to protect girls and women who are involved in it. Whereas to call it forced marriage, obviously, is to state a much more kind of adamant claim about the need for the state to get involved and really crack down and really step in and try to maybe fully eliminate this practice. So in that sense, I think that whether we call something forced marriage or whether we choose perhaps an indigenous term for the practice really matters a lot, and the kind of perceptions of that practice that it evokes, and then the kind of claims that we're implicitly making about what states and NGOs and other actors should do to intervene.